start with a very important fact for many of you who don't know the US, which is, where is Indiana? Ask that all the time, and I felt I should let you know we're right pretty much in the middle of the country in what is called the Midwest. Moving on to more important things, my original work had to do with male batterers. I developed a typology of male batterers, have worked in batterer programs, but more recently I've moved into a new area that I'm going to talk about today, which is focused on couples who are separating or divorcing. In the US, this is quite a prevalent occurrence. The figure is actually even higher than that. About 40% of children will experience their parents separating by the time they're age 18. I don't know the comparable figures here. And as I'm sure you know, violence is also a prevalent problem in the US, with over 50%, and it's intertwined in the sense that over 50% of couples seeking divorce report having violence, and often women report, as you know, that the violence continues after separation. That's partly exacerbated by the children, which is the focus of my talk today, because you've got exchanged children, share custody, et cetera, so that gives opportunities for the violence to continue. Both things, both parental separation and divorce, increase risk for children. For example, I'm sure you know about the violence data, but divorce doubles the risk for children of behavioral and emotional problems from about 12%, this is at a clinical diagnosable level, from about 12% of children from intact families to 25% of children from divorced families having these problems. I've left out a lot of things in between these arrows because the one I want to focus on is interparental conflict, which is obviously related to violence, that divorce and separation, if it's followed by continuing conflict, leads to problems for the children or the offspring. Now, in the US, traditionally divorce and parental separation was handled in the court system, which is a very adversarial system. If you have the money, you get attorneys. If you don't, you go to court without an attorney. You argue your side, and the judge makes a decision about very important things. How much custody money will the one parent receive from the other? How much parenting time will they each have with the children? A lot of people in the US began to worry that this adversarial process where you're fighting and you're trying to put the other person down and increase your own outcomes leads to more sorry, I'm getting lots of signals that I'm talking too fast, so I'll slow down. Leads to increases in interparental conflict, which is what we're trying to avoid. So there has been a new focus on, I shouldn't say new actually, it's been 20 or 30 years, on mediation as an alternative. Where the couples come in and meet with the mediator, the two parties meet with the mediator and try to come up with their own agreement instead of going to court. In the US, this has become very widespread. In fact, in most places, judges and courts say you cannot come to court until you've tried mediation. So it's a very common experience for couples who are separated. And I'm interested in that setting in what we know about violence. Well, to explain, as I said, the assumptions about mediation's benefits are that parents are actively involved, so they're determining their own outcomes. Because of that, they may be more likely to stick to their agreements and not have conflict around it. They would know their own children's needs better than a judge who doesn't know their children or know them. And so the idea might be that they would make better agreements for their children. The problem is we do not have much data about whether these assumptions are true or not. The flip side of this is a long argument without much data on it, I'll tell you right now, but about whether mediation is appropriate or safe for couples who have violence. It's kind of like the debate that Dr. Stith will talk about later about couples therapy. Should we give mediation to couples who have violence? The concerns are probably obvious to all of you. Safety, both during the mediation process and afterwards. Will a victim be beaten up because she talks about something that irritates the abuser in mediation or asks for things? If there are power imbalances in the relationship, the concern is that the perpetrator's coercion combined with the victim's fear may lead the victim to make agreements that are not in the best interest of the victim or the children because of fear, etc. Proponents for mediation counter by saying, well, we can individually tailor safeguards for these couples. Many victims are capable of promoting interests of themselves and children and want mediation. And we don't know that going to court is going to be any better for victims of violence. I'm going today to just touch on 3 more specific controversies in this area within this large controversy of whether mediation should even be offered to couples who have experienced violence. The first one, if any of you are working in this area, it's become clear to me that we need to train mediators to screen for violence. So again, on the one side, I think our arguments most of us would agree on that we need to know about violence before we can make a decision as a mediator of whether to let the couple come to mediation and how to address things safely. And we need systematic screening. As most of you probably know, we would argue you should screen all cases. You should separate the parties so that they can speak freely. I would argue you should use behaviorally specific screens because they detect the most violence or most sensitive to that. Questions that directly ask about violent behaviors. When I present this to mediators, the other side of the controversy is that many of them tell me they don't think violence is a frequent problem for their clients. They say it doesn't happen, I don't see it, it's just not a big deal. Or they believe they're already adequately screening for violence. So we did some studies, and I won't go into the details, but I want to just tell you we compared the way mediators were screening to using a behavioral screen. The way the mediators at the IU stands for Indiana University clinic were trained was they first of all received training in violence, so they were supposedly sensitized to the issue, thinking about it. They were able to check legal records. One of the beauties of working with the court system is they have lots of access to look at civil records, criminal records, protective orders, see if there's any hints of violence. And they would separate the parties and ask them about things like concerns about sitting with one another or conflict. They thought this screening was adequate, and actually it is quite good for a mediation clinic. If you ask what mediation clinics are doing, this is a pretty thorough screening. We hypothesized that they were under-detecting violence, and we recommended they use a behaviorally specific screen. And I'm giving you one example question here. Something like, in the past 12 months, how often did the other parent choke or strangle you? There are lots of questions like that. What we found was that mediators did not even suspect violence in over half of the cases where the parties actually reported violence on that screening questionnaire. So they're missing over half the cases. That is one major message I want to give today. I think most of you are aware of screening, but whenever we move into a new field, I think we have to rediscuss that issue with people, because often they have a quite different concept of what violence is and how to screen for it. Luckily, in this case, the mediation staff did agree then to do systematic screening. And there's a question of what measure to use, because many measures are copyrighted. I'm not pushing our measure, but I wanted to tell you that this is a free, non-copyrighted measure if somebody wants to take a look at it, that we've developed and are now testing, called the Mediator's Assessment of Safety Issues and Concerns, or the MASIC. Okay, so just wanted to mention that. The second controversy that I want to mention is if you detect the violence, now if we get people screening and detecting violence, what changes should they make? What accommodations should they make in the procedures? Okay, and mediators struggle with this. I've just put up a few examples, some simple security steps, like staggering when people arrive or leave from the clinic, maybe walking a woman to the car if she needs to be accompanied, asking the woman, or encouraging actually, or even providing for her a support person or an advocate, even from example from the shelter, or an attorney to be there with her, so that she can make sure that or the victim can make sure that their rights are being addressed and they are being heard. Or what is called shuttle mediation, which is that you do not see the parties together, but you go back and forth between them, often in the same building, but sometimes it's even done by phone. What's interesting at this point to me as a researcher is that we have no data on whether people are using these accommodations and what the impact of them is. Does a victim actually feel safer if some of these steps are taken? Does it actually improve the process or lead to better agreements or lead to better safety? We're doing some ongoing pilot work with this right now. But until that point, mediators will have to use their own judgment. The third controversy really has to do, I think, for me, with the heat of the meat of the issue, which is once a mediator is aware of violence, should that impact the content of the agreements the couples reach? Should a mediator say to violent couples, you need to think about certain issues and whether to consider them in your agreement? For example, on the one side, people would say, yes, you might want them to think about whether they should have supervised exchanges of children. So when they get together to exchange their children a couple times a week, there's somebody there, to help them if they start to have conflict. Or depending on the violence and who it's directed at, should parenting time actually be supervised? One side says yes, another side says no, that this violates key concepts of mediation. Mediators in the US believe strongly in party self-determination, that the parties have to determine on their own terms whether to reach an agreement and what the agreement will be about, and that the mediator must be impartial and neutral, cannot take sides and cannot care about what's in that agreement. So they say that violates our ethics. To start looking at this question, we did some research to say, are there grounds for concerns? What do the agreements of violent families look like? So I've looked at the few studies that compare the content of agreements reached by violent and nonviolent cases. And I think there are grounds for concerns. In these studies, and there are not many of those studies, there are very few differences in the agreements of violent and nonviolent couples. Custody, legal custody, which is who gets to make the decisions about children, is not different between violent and nonviolent couples in the US, and it's mostly what we call joint or shared. That's fertile grounds for arguments every time we have to make a major decision about the children. Physical custody, who does the child live with and who's the residential parent, doesn't differ between violent and nonviolent couples. Another grounds for arguing. Even things, again, like should exchanges of children be supervised, or should they be at least conducted in a public place where there's less chance of violence breaking out, does not differ between the agreements of violent and nonviolent couples. No differences in things like referrals to counseling. So very few differences. I think that this data is making people stop and think about this issue, but the controversy still continues because the mediators firmly believing they should not insist that certain things be included in agreements. I've only got a couple more points to make, and one is I think that this is a new area for violence people to think about and that we need to consider some additional issues. One that I think is very important, I mentioned earlier, but is the question of how these violent cases would fare if they weren't in mediation. The things I'm saying may have you worried. You may be thinking, boy, mediation sounds like a possible problem, but really we, again, don't know what would happen if these cases went to court instead. Many judges are not well trained in violence issues. They don't have much time to deal with cases or to listen to both sides. It's possible the outcomes would be even worse for cases that go to court. Also possible because of power and money differences. If the man can hire a high-powered lawyer and the wife cannot, she may be at a disadvantage. I also think it's very important in this field, when you talk to mediators, the outcome they're most focused on are client satisfaction and whether or not the couple reached an agreement. They're very into their agreement rates. And in my mind, that's, again, not the important outcome. The important outcome is what is the content of those agreements and how, ultimately, does that affect the safety and well-being of both the children and the parents. So we need longitudinal work to follow these couples over time after mediation to see if we're actually able to protect people and protect people's interests. We have a long way to go. There are a lot of unanswered questions. The goals, as I said, are really safety for all people and minimizing the negative impacts of parental separation and violence on children. And again, I think that this area is illustrative of what happens when you move into a new area where people know less about violence and you want to think about what are the important issues, what are things that people should be thinking about how violence may affect their clients or the people they're working with. Thank you.